Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. And for all of you who are watching, we would ask for a little bit of prayer because, as you can tell, I am not in the museum, nor am I at home. I am on the road once again and down near Yeovil this time. I will be speaking at a public meeting tomorrow and then at a church on Sunday. And we've had a little bit of Wi-Fi connection issues, so I'm trying to use my own Wi-Fi box that I brought with me, but we've been having all sorts of trouble this evening. So just pray that the stream holds out, and if I do drop off, you'll know the reason why. However, we have got several good sections, programs from Glenn and from Craig and from Diane lined up, and of course Sam is around in case there's any issues, so he can take over. That's absolutely fine. All right, well, we're going to start off tonight. Our topic is sort of after the flood. Okay, so after the flood, we're looking at the changes that have happened between creation and then particularly between creation and the flood, and then after the flood, because you'll find, although that there's definitely this good to bad to worse picture in the Bible, a lot of the mechanisms to have produce this good to bad to worse would have happened at the time of the flood. So we're going to delve into a little bit of that, and I'm just going to sort of kick things off and introduce things briefly while I've still got the Wi-Fi and the camera working, and then we'll go over to Glenn. So if we start, when you start in the...
Yep, cut out.
I think he's dropped off.
I think he's dropped off. You want me to go ahead and go?
Yeah, I think that's probably best, Glenn. If you want to just dive into your section, and then we'll just pick it up after that.
All right, let me call up my slides. All right, I'm sharing those with you now. So even though we're talking about after the flood, I wanted to set the stage for what it was like before the flood. On day 2, that says that the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So day 2, we've got this formless earth. It's completely covered in water, and we know water is formless. It can take on any shape. And then there was light, but there was no sun. It was God illuminated it, just as he's going to do with the new heaven and new earth that we read about in Revelation. Well, on day 2, then it says, then let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which are above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and it was evening, it was morning, the second day. One of the questions is, what then was below this water? Was there already land below the water, or was it just all water? Well, let's look at day 3, because I think it really gives us some guidance. Day 3 says, then let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Well, notice it doesn't say that land was created on day 3. It said, let it appear. And the dry land, the word in the Hebrew, Yabashah, is the same word not only used here, but used elsewhere. It's the same word used when they step off the ark onto dry land. It's the same word used when Moses parted the Red Sea. All right. And it's the same word used when the Jordan was parted. And in each of those cases, there was always land already below the waters. So I think it's pretty clear that there was land on day 2 below the waters. Now, why is this significant? So I think it was more of this picture. There was water, but there was land below it. Now, why is this important? It was because there was no sun at this time. There was no moon. So there wasn't any gravity effects, shifting tides. There was no thermal gradients creating wind. And so you would have a perfectly calm water. Well, when sediment settles out in perfectly calm water, it's going to be very flat, very level. That's consistent with the fact that the Bible makes no mentions of mountains or hills. So we think that it's very uniform topography. Now that's important for some other things. And what we're leading to is how things were different after the flood, particularly how the climate was different. So we know on day 3, he also produced vegetation. And after producing vegetation, he said that it was very good. Well, I believe that he produced very good soil. The Bible talks about, Jesus uses the parable of the good soil. So if he's going to make the land to produce vegetation for all the animals, I think he would clearly put it as very good soil. All right, so what do we know later? At the end of the creation week, he says, be fruitful and multiply. And he says this, fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the earth. Then God said, behold, I've given every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I've given every green plant for food. And it was so. So, a couple of things. Before the flood, God created all the creatures to be vegetarians. And he told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, that would be a lot easier to do given that it talked previously about he gathered the waters into seas. So that says that these water bodies were the ones that were isolated. It was the earth that was continuous. So the earth we see today is not the earth before the flood. I think the earth would have been predominantly land so that these animals would have all this green vegetation to grow on, and this land would be the one that's continuous. So if God told you, to tell all the animals to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, but they can only eat plants, how would you make it? How would you design the earth? Would you design it with 70% of it being water? Would you design the land being 50% of it rock, as it is today, which is not very productive for vegetation? Would you make it mountains, which causes temperature fluctuations to where then you have arid regions and you would have winds, you'd have erosion? Or would you design it to where all the land could produce lush vegetation? So again, I think it's very clear the land was very uniform. Yet we continually see this types of pictures of the Garden of Eden. And what's wrong with these pictures? Well, in all of these, you've got mountains, you've got beautiful waterfalls, but waterfalls such as these in the bottom left and the bottom right, that's an erosion feature. That's a picture of destruction. Erosion is a destructive process. That's a plunge pool. So you've got erosion cutting the stream, and then you've got a plunge pool, which is extremely destructive to God's very good earth. I don't think that's a picture of creation until after the flood. And it's beautiful today, but God's ways are not our ways. So this is what we learn in Genesis 2. It says, this is the account of heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made earth and heaven. It goes on to say, for the Lord had not sent rain upon the earth. Well, we get rain today, but it tells us it didn't rain then. So how did it water? It says, but a mist used to rise from the earth and not water a part of the earth, not water local areas. It watered the whole surface of the earth. Now, one of the theories early on in creation science was this canopy of saturated air above. That's not what it says. It says a mist rose every day. So how do you get a mist that would rise over all the earth, and the earth is predominantly land? Well, it's very easy. If you've got fairly uniform, shallow soils, which had been covered in water, but that water has infiltrated into the subsurface, you're going to have a shallow water table. And that shallow water table, water does move uphill. All you have to do to find out if water can move uphill, we always think, oh, water moves downhill. No, water moves uphill. All you have to do is take one of your tissues out of your kitchen, one of your paper towels, and dip it in a bowl of water, and you'll watch it rises up the up the cloth. Well, so what do we have? I think what we have is that you have a uniform topography, no wind, no rain, no erosion, mild temperature, daily temperature changes, very mild, such that Adam and Eve could walk around without clothes on and not freeze or anything else. it would have been a year-round continual growth. You wouldn't have any types of seasons, and it would have been perfect until sin entered. Once there's sin entered, then there's death, and the ground is cursed, and it's going to produce weeds and thorns, and there's going to be death. We're going to return to dust. So if there's no animal death before this time and no erosion, would we have animal fossils? Would we even have plant fossils if there's a continuous growing season? And then, because of man's sin, what happened? God sent a flood. And that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the day. But God gave us a promise. So when they exited the ark, Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird. We tend to think of it, well, he just sacrificed one or two animals. No, he took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. There's a reason it said it took them by sevens, the clean ones, so that he could offer one as a sacrifice. And God said, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I'll never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night. Now you may think, okay, there's day and night. No, he's talking about temperature fluctuations. Now we have extreme temperature fluctuations between day and night. They wouldn't have had that before the flood. And so you see right there, climate change. The climate has changed drastically. Now there isn't this continual growing season all year long. There's seed time and harvest. There's seasons, and there's cold and there's hot, and summer and winter. So what we see today is not the key to the past. The past is the key to what we see today. And when you see a beautiful waterfall, just remember, that's a picture of God's judgment. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Craig's going to talk more about the effects of the climate change after the flood. Oops, I lost y'all. And so go to me, if you would, zoom in on me.
Yeah.
Because I want to show something here that Craig's going to talk about. And that is, I've got a little display here. I don't know if you can see that. What does that look like? Well, it's like a tooth, but it's not my tooth. It's a mammoth tooth. And from what I understand, this isn't the biggest of mammoth teeth. And I've also got a nice little bone, and that's a mammoth bone. You can see inside it. You can see just how porous it is. So that's what Craig is going to talk about. He's going to talk about the effects of this change of the flood on the climate. He's going to talk about mammoths. Right, Craig?
Yeah, we're certainly going to get to that. I just want to make brief mention on a couple of things you brought up there. The amount of plants, for example, that we see in the fossil record in the coal layers and so on around the world, the volume and even the size of some of these plants and the trees all speak to a world that was once much more lush than we see now. It was immensely covered with lush vegetation, and I mean, we've got not just coal, but we've got fossilized plants all over the place, including they find it under the sea when they drill and find fossils. Even just off the north of Tasmania, we've got underneath Bass Strait, we've got coal seams that are 3 kilometres plus down. So it's all over the place. But a lot of Christians really struggle, and other people that are considering this subject really struggle with the idea that the world was once very much different. They can't get their head around volcanoes, for example, not being there and operating in the pre-flood world, earthquakes, hurricanes or tornadoes not operating in the pre-flood world. The world was different. It was different to what we know and understand now. And we basically live in a world now that is sort of settling down in sort of weather sort of ways. That'll continue to change, but in the period immediately after the flood, it was probably a lot more dramatic than what we even see now. So we still get tornadoes, we still get earthquakes, big ones, we still get volcanoes. But I think in the hundreds of years post-flood, some of these things were very dramatic, probably as a direct result of the flood. Well, definitely as a direct result of the flood, but some of the environmental and geological features and ice age and so on after the flood brought about some fairly major changes. So I just wanted to start, if I could go to my slides. Thanks. Yep, there we are. I just wanted to start with this passage in 2 Peter chapter 3, which says, "By the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water." So Peter initially starts off saying how it was created out of water, but I want to focus on this line here that says, "by which the world that then existed perished." So this very statement seems to infer of how the world was different, the world that then existed. This is exactly what we're talking about in this subject. The world has very much changed. So we shouldn't get caught into the idea that everything that we see, even all the fossils, is a result of the Great Flood. There were a lot of other catastrophic events that happened after the flood, and we've got to take these into consideration as well. So some of these are the Ice Age, and by the way, the flood model really explains the Ice Age better than anything secular science can do. There is catastrophic flooding towards the end of the Ice Age, and we'll make brief mention of that. With the Ice Age, there was dramatic sea level changes, so it fell and then it rose towards the end of it. And there's predictions of very, very strong windstorms, stronger than what we even see today, as part of the Ice Age and end of the Ice Age period. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, continuing on. So I just wanted to talk about the catastrophic Ice Age and how the Bible story and Bible history really explains it a lot better than what secular science can. As Joe, I remember, said once when he asked his geology lecturer, where did the Ice Ages come from? And the response was, well, when you find out, let me know. So they don't know where the snow and ice could come from. It's very difficult with long ages. But in the flood world, as a post-flood world, as Glenn has discussed, what we've got is still a mild temperature ocean, because as Glenn raised, Adam and Eve were both without clothes initially, so that infers that the climate was mild year-round, and therefore the oceans would have been relatively warm. So when you've got a warm ocean and you've got a cold atmosphere, which is brought about by the huge volcanic eruptions, the mist in the air, the basically blocking of the sun, the flood model basically says that within a couple of hundred years, there's dramatic and catastrophic cooling, and therefore you get massive snowfalls, and that turns to ice eventually, and you get this catastrophic inundation of ice across particularly the northern hemisphere and parts of the southern hemisphere as well. Just by way of example, just a couple of years ago, there was a huge volcanic eruption in Tonga, and here's an article that I found on Australia's ABC News, and it says that the Tonga volcano eruption may affect our weather for up to 8 years. Well, that's one eruption. We're predicting through the flood period that there were multiple volcanic eruptions throughout the world. So you can imagine the impact that would ultimately have on climate systems post-flood. And this was a very dramatic event. Now, this is from Job, chapter 38. There's a couple of other places in Job. I think chapter 6 is another one of them where Job speaks of ice. It's probably the oldest book in the Bible. He's somewhere in the Middle East, and this is God speaking to Job, the record of God speaking to Job in chapter 38. And God's saying, have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail? From whose womb comes the ice and the frost of heaven? Who gives it birth? So Job isn't questioning, well, what's snow? What's ice, God? I don't even know what you're talking about. Of course he knows what's being talked about, and he's in the Middle East somewhere. We're not exactly sure where he was. He's possibly in the Sumerian area, or he's possibly in the land of Canaan area. We're not exactly sure. But either way, he knows what snow and ice are, and he can't answer the question. When you go and read his response, he basically lays it out to God, I can't answer these questions. And the snow and ice results of the flood, of this dramatic cooling in the atmosphere and the evaporation from the warm ocean that provides the moisture content required. Okay, so what happened to the mammoths? How do we explain some of the mass burials of mammals that are found across particularly the northern climates, the northern latitudes in Siberia, Alaska and other areas? And if Joe was on, he might be able to talk about some of the mammoths that he's uncovered, even around the UK. But they thrived, absolutely thrived in the Northern Hemisphere post-flood, even through the Ice Age. So sometimes we have this picture of the Ice Age where just everything is completely covered with ice. But one of the things that I've learned in the last few years that I find incredibly intriguing is the fact that the lowland areas in northern Russia, northern Siberia, and in Alaska were glacial free. They were believed by even secular science to be very, very lush. And how would you explain this? Well, again, the warm oceans help explain it. You get warm weather and breezes and so on coming off the warm ocean, and you don't have the glaciers. The glaciers are more inland and in the higher areas, and you've got this belt of really lush vegetation post-flood. And so the permafrost hadn't kicked in at this time. It was great for many animals, the woolly mammoths, there's woolly rhinoceroses, there was deer and horses as well throughout these areas. Not horses in Alaska, I don't believe, but horses certainly in the Siberian area. And something happened, something changed. By the way, the number of mammoths is believed to be enormous, and in using the reproduction rates of elephants that we know today, you can actually make estimates of how many mammoths might be present in a lush environment within, say, the first 500 to 700 years post-flood, and it works out to be well over 8 million as an absolute minimum, but depending on the birth rate you use, you can get up to 600 million mammoths possible in that time frame using elephant birth rates. So you can have large numbers of these creatures even through the Ice Age, which the flood models, and Michael Ord, I'll show you the book I've got here, Frozen in Time, a great book, very interesting, by Michael Ord, that discusses a lot of these things in detail. and he speaks of how you get such large numbers of these creatures in that time, and including through the Ice Age. But he raises that the Ice Age started about 200 or 300 years post-flood, which brings us around the time where Job wrote his book, or it was written about Job at least. And they are presumed to become extinct about 700 years post-flood. Why? Well, the glacial maximum is estimated to be about 500 years post-flood, but in the deglacial period, the temperatures actually plummeted, and a whole bunch of other things happened as well. So as the glaciers started to melt, you get some massive flooding, you get actually colder air, you get all this fresh cold water running off the mountains and down into the oceans, and you got the fresh water goes over the top of the salt water. And we actually see that in the estuary that we've got here. You can see the fresh water in flood times coming down in over the top of the saltwater tides that come in. Many people listening would be aware of this sort of phenomena. The fresh water comes in over the top, but this was cold, very cold, and that's where you started to get sea ice. And so the sea ice started to build up, and the ocean started to cool, and so you get this very cold weather. So Ord speculates that a lot of the mammoths did die from cold during this time, and a lot of the other creatures that were in those climates. The permafrost starts to kick in, and you get massive flooding as well. But this isn't necessarily the explanation as to why the mammoths became extinct. Ord comes up with a very, very interesting hypothesis as to why the mammoths became extinct. Well, I mean, they're of the elephant kind, so you can argue that the elephants we've got around today are still about, but the mammoth variety, if you like, of the elephant kind are certainly not with us now. And what he highlights is that most of them are found in wind-blown silt. You find a lot of these mammoths in wind-blown silt. Many of them are actually deteriorating very badly, so they haven't been fallen into a cold bog or a peat bog and then frozen straight away, and you hear all of these stories of their stomach contents and their bodies being highly preserved. Well, that's true in a few cases, but the majority of them are found very badly deteriorated. And there's other reasons we can find some of these things in their gut because of the type of guts they've got. And they're actually found in wind-blown silt. So how does he explain this? Well, during the Ice Age, things become very dry. It's a very dry and very cold environment. And as the glaciers and the snow retreats towards the end of the glacial maximum, the model predicts very, very strong winds, stronger winds than we understand in the northern latitudes now. And this would have caused catastrophic windstorms. And this is what you find the mammoths buried in. So I'm not sure if there's people in North America that have seen these, but I've seen quite a number of pictures of whole houses and whole farms buried in silt. And I think I've got a picture here, just one that I found of a highway covered in sand, but that's not even near as dramatic as you can find pictures online of whole farmhouses covered in sand. And this is what he's postulating happened, that they were dramatically killed by massive windstorms and sandstorms that occurred across the northern latitudes. And it's called Lus, I think Glenn's the best one to pronounce that for us, but it's called loess. It's spelled Loess. Strange spelling of a word, but it's called loess, and you do find it all across the planet. And just an idea to throw in, and I've got no real backing for it, but when Michael Ord suggests that this was about 700 years post-flood, this seems to align roughly with the period of Isaac and Jacob. And I just wonder, what about the massive famine that was had and found in Canaan during the time of Joseph's reign, second in charge in Egypt? That's just an idea to throw out there. Is this some of the changes in the weather that are happening around about that time? So 700 years post-flood, the mammoths are extinct, and a lot of those other creatures in the Siberian and northern climes, like the woolly rhinoceros, are gone forever. So, come back to us now. Thanks, Sam, and that's what I've got. Thanks very much.
I'd like to add a couple of things to what you said. You mentioned the elephant birth rates. If anyone has questions about that, you can go to our USA website, creationresearchusa.org. We've got information sheets. They're sort of like the fact files, and one of them is on the population growth of elephants and how it would be easily in the millions by the time of this ice age that's predicted by these creationist weather models that show that it happened 200 to 700 years after the flood. I'd also add, yes, I've worked a lot on the loess soils up on the Loess Plateau in China, the loess soils in America, and these are always just down below where the ice sheets and glaciers would have been across the northern continents. And if you remember when I talked about the black soil region and these beautiful black soils, well, that was in these grassland prairies that I was working in the southern part of this Siberian plain where all of these woolly mammoths would have been. And what produced that black soil was that these were grassland prairies, deep black soils. Now, even today, they still freeze to a meter to a meter and a half every winter. But then in the summer, they're back to being these beautiful grasslands. And it's the most productive region in all China. It's the only region of China where they produce more food than they consume, and they export from that region. And that goes all the way up into Russia, into Siberia. So it would have been an ideal area for these woolly mammoths and all the other animals associated with it. I'd also say interesting things about the loess soils. What Michael Ord had said was that you get these massive windstorms. Well, winds governed by the temperature differential. So you've got these ice sheets of cold air, and then you've got these areas down below that are heating up. You're going to have massive winds. Well, in North America, we had our Dust Bowl era, and it buried houses, it buried animals, and so he's proposing that these woolly mammoths were standing in place and were buried, and that's why they many times have broken legs trying to fight their way out of them.
That's it. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is the loess soils aren't usually the sands; they're usually fine silts, and it has got the highest capillary capacity to draw water up from below, and so this water then would be capillary action, rising the water up, wicking the water up, and then freezing them in place. So it's a perfect scenario for getting these woolly mammoths to be frozen in place. You got a big storm event, they get buried, they sit there buried after they're dead, and then comes the next winter, and that moisture that's now risen up into that silt loam soil is going to freeze. And then you find a woolly mammoth frozen in place, and you're thinking, now how did it get down into the permafrost?
That's great, Glenn. That really adds a lot. And it's just one of these examples of where there's a mass extinction that's not a result of the flood. It's a result of post-flood processes.
Yes.
And one of the other one of the other things I meant to mention was I briefly mentioned it was the massive flooding that occurred as a result of the ice melt.
Yes.
And many people would be familiar that are listening here today of the Lake Missoula flood. I think that's pretty widely recognised now as a massive regional flood. There's another one that's lesser known in the Siberian area. I think it's called the Lake Og flood. There's many major rivers that are coming out of Siberia now. And there's others even in Tasmania where we are. I've seen evidences of at the base of gorges coming off the Central Highlands where there's massive erosion channels well away from the rivers and big floodplains at the end of them where quite possibly water trapped on top of the highlands in a melt has burst forth down through a gorge and carved out all of these channels at the bottom.
Yeah, the world that we live in today is not the world of the past, and you can't take what we measure today and extrapolate to the past because it was radically different. You know, I always wondered about how the promised land was this land of flowing with milk and honey. It was totally different then. It probably, at that time, you're talking at the end of the Ice Age, was much wetter. And as we talked about last week, the key nutrient is water. It's why Australia, when they do get rains, it greens up. You just don't get rains that often. I went to Death Valley here in America, the lowest spot, I think the lowest spot in the world, the highest temperatures in the world. My wife had been to it previously and just said it's ugly, it's dead, it's just ugly. There's nothing alive. And I went to it after a rain, and it was just covered in vegetation, one of the prettiest places I've ever seen in my life. It was just solid flowers everywhere because there was water. Well, what took place after the Ice Age was ending? You've got these lush areas, but climate changed, and it's desert today.
Yeah. And keep in mind too, I mentioned the time of Joseph and the 7-year drought and how his family had to travel down to Egypt in that drought from Canaan, which 400 or 500 years later, when Moses is going back to it, it is lush again. So climate change, and it goes up and it goes down, and it was a dramatic drought, and there was a dramatic recovery after that.
Yes. And it's all, when it comes to vegetation, it's all about the water. You can grow plants without soil. I hate to say that as a soil scientist, but you can.
They grow better in soil. That's what they're designed to grow in.
If you grow without soil, it's a lot more work, but it can be done.
Should we have a couple of questions before we go to Diane's? Or
well, it's certainly been lively in the chat. There's been a debate on trees, which we've been asked to address. So I'll see if I can pull that up here. So there was a comment brought forward.
Yeah, there was a
comment. Here we go.
I haven't seen any of it.
Here we go. Before the flood, trees used to grow to 36 kilometers, and then went on to say
6,000 meters.
This 36 kilometers was where dew used to form before the flood. After the flood, the dew point dropped down to the ground level, becoming symbolic of Jesus coming down to earth. We've been asked to address this by multiple people in the chat. So is this entirely possible?
We have a forestry person there. Is it true that we have 36 kilometer, I'm assuming, diameter trees, Craig?
Well, I'm not aware of the evidences that would point to anything like that. There are physical constraints on things as well. Yes, some trees can take in moisture in the leaves, but really getting the moisture requirements for a 36 kilometre high tree, one of them, let alone a whole bunch of them, is beyond scientific credibility as far as I'm concerned.
And there's no evidence for it. What they're talking about is the basalts. We're talking about the Devil's Tower and other features like that. We've talked about that
Yes.
in the past. Sorry, the internet, don't trust it. It's not trees. It's not
They're not
fossilized
trees, no.
It's a geological formation. We do not
Shaped by the
have
flood.
trees at large. Yes.
100%. There's not even a shadow of doubt about that. And this is something that actually secular scientists and Christian scientists can agree is that, which in this sort of field can be some form of a rarity, is that these formations are rock. They're not trees at all.
Yes.
But yeah, it's good to see. And thank you, KLR 650 for joining in the chat. It's really great to see. But very big list of accomplishments. They've got 2 BSc, 1 in biology and 1 in chemistry, MSc in chemistry, PhD in chemistry, postdoc studies in botany, and he's a born again Christian.
Awesome.
I know creationist as well. So it's brilliant. Great to see you here.
Hello, all. Let me just jump in very quickly because I've jumped in and I've already been frozen out twice in the last minute that I've been waiting here. So thank you for everybody who was welcoming me back, but I may not be back for very long, so we'll see how it goes. But I appear to have jumped in as a Q&A point, which is good.
Yes. Right. Okay. So we've got another one here. Douglas Boffey. How do Rodinia, Pangaea, Gondwana, and Laurasia fit into the scriptures?
Well, the scriptures don't mention any of those, but I believe, as I talked about, the earth was predominantly land. And then when God broke open the fountains of the deep, in Psalms it talks about the mountains rose and the valleys sank. I think a lot of these land surfaces sank. And they were no more. They're not existent. But
you've got to remember that most of the continental shelf is, a significant portion of the continental shelf is underwater today. And this is continental shelf, right? It's part of the continent, and you can see this in places like Iceland, where you have 2 continental shelves that are come together, and it disappears in the sea either side of it. One thing you need to be wary of whenever you have big technical names like this is number one, make sure that you're not getting bogged down with evolutionary interpretation of the names. So it's the same with any kind of geological name that you have, right? Jurassic and Cretaceous and all these things conjure up images and sort of visions of millions of years, and the reality is they're just nice names for rocks, basically, and there's a lot of history with them as well, right? So number one, make sure you don't, because these names have been reinterpreted, if you like, or they're viewed today as different stages of Earth's history, where these have slowly drifted apart over millions of years. But like Glenn said, if you go to the Bible, just purely going from the Bible, he gathered the water together into one place and the dry land appeared. So you have strong implication of one mass of water, one mass of land, the specifics of which we're not given too much detail about, but you do have this picture of one mass of water, one mass of land, and that fits with what we see in geology, right? Geology has also said that at some point in Earth's past, this one last mass of land has been split up. And you can match that up with what it says in the scriptures as well, where it talks about in both the global flood as well as in Psalm 104, where you get this picture of it. So they fit in quite nicely. The main disagreement is timings.
Timing. When did that split up occur? I think that by the fact that we have like 1.5 miles of sediment over these and the same features in America that you see in Europe, that happened near the end of the flood, late in the event.
And we need to acknowledge that there is scientific evidence of the connection of South America with Australia, for example, with New Zealand, with even places like India. Just in the fossil record, there's some very, very similar fossils, similar geologies. Joe can correct me on this, but I'm certainly aware of, for example, eucalypt fossils in South America. And we've lost Joe again. But there's no question at all that there's these evidences that would link the different sort of continents and subcontinents to some closer proximity.
And the difference is, like Joe said, in the timing, because, I believe, and I think all of our team does, in this catastrophic plate tectonics. that it wasn't a millimeter a year movement. It was a very rapid, massive movement of the separation of the continents that we have now.
I'm muted. There we go. Right, great stuff. Let's move on to another question. Here we go. Question from Sandy C. Was the Grand Canyon a result of massive flooding from ice melting?
All right, so this is a hot debate among creationists because we've got two schools of thought. One of the schools of thought is that the Grand Canyon was eroded by the floodwaters as they were coming off the continent. I think there's several problems with that. I do believe it was from ice age, ice melt, but not as you think of like the Lake Missoula flood. That was an ice dam break. I think the much more likely is that you had this Great Lakes, the Hopi Lakes. They're bigger than our Great Lakes of today. And that because of tectonic movement, because of earthquakes, that dam breached. And that's what cut the Grand Canyon. I think it was by a piping break, dam breach. It wouldn't have been by floodwaters overtopping that dam. That was a slower process. You start getting, then you're getting flow only as fast as you've got flow coming in. But if you bust it down at the bottom by an earthquake, you poke a hole in the bottom of the pool, that water is going to come out a lot faster than you're just pouring in too much water and it's spilling over the top of the pool. That would be such a rapid dam breach that you would get a Grand Canyon that not only would form, it would form a V shape as the Grand Canyon is. It would cut down into the metamorphic rock, igneous rock, down at the bottom below the unconformity, because it would be traveling at such a faster velocity than just if it was a spilling over or if it was the floodwaters receding off the continents. And it would explain why we can't find the sediment that was in the Grand Canyon. You ought to have at the end of a gully, whenever I do gully erosion research, you can see the sediment fan at the end of the gully. You don't find that in the Grand Canyon, and at the end it makes this kind of 90-degree turn. So I think it was because of ice melt waters, but it wasn't a flood event like the Missoula flood. I think it was a much different event. And I've talked to more than one creation scientist who have spoken to the Hopi Native Americans, the Hopi Indians, and they have a tradition that they say that they lived around a lake, that they came in from the north, settled around a lake. Well, there's no lake there now. They settled around a lake, and one day they heard an explosion and the ground shook and the water disappeared, and they followed it into the canyon. That fits perfectly with, I think, what took place. So anyway, that's kind of
that's really interesting.
I think it is.
Sorry, can you say that again, Glenn? That end bit.
That there's the two creation theories as to what took place, but I think the one that's much more supported by erosion dynamics, as well as the Hopi Indians tradition that they've passed down, I think fits with, there was giant lakes there from ice waters, ice age waters, and that they breached because of a earthquake, and it caused piping. It caused a fracture in the dam, and it would have just massively, suddenly.
Well, generally, the best science we've got, Glenn, is observations of people who were there.
Yes.
Yep. 100%. Right. Okay. We forgot to do this earlier. Doki Doki sent in a super sticker for $1.99 US buckaroos. A thumbs up. Cheers, Doki. Thanks so much. Right. Let's leave that there for now, and let's move on to our next topic. And then after that, we can do a bit more Q&A. So going on to you, Diane. Now, I believe you're tackling diet.
Yes, now for something completely different, but it does relate to statements that are made by God immediately after the flood. So we do need to address them in the context of talking about after the flood. So if we could go to my slides, thanks. If we've got those up now. If we go back to Genesis 8, as Glenn has already brought up, and Craig, and in our discussion, we have this statement: while the earth remains, this is a promise made by God, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So the Lord is telling us that from now on there will be regular patterns and cycles, but we are going to get some extremes, and we are going to get very dominant seasons that in the very good world before the flood would not have been quite so dominant. There would have been some variation, but not quite the extremes that we have now. But these regular patterns and cycles with the seasonal extremes are going to go on. And notice it says there will be periods of cold and heat. And we have thousands of years of observations from the people who were there. As Craig said, the most important observations we have are those from the witnesses who were there. Now, we may not have the sort of satellite precise measurements that we have these days, but we do have agricultural history where we know there were cold times, there were hot times, and in between times, and there were periods of drought and ice that have already been mentioned, and all of those are going to impact on the biology and on what people and animals are able to eat. But God also makes a couple of interesting statements that seem to be a bit arbitrary. And this is a rather strange one that gets skipped over quite a lot. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, and upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish in the sea. Now, aren't you frustrated? I know that I am, when some particularly birds fly away before you can get anywhere near them, but I'm not going to hurt them. But there is that innate fear. And as anyone who's tried to catch fish know, that that can be quite difficult. And if animals didn't have some sort of fear and dread from us, we would probably have wiped them out before now. So this is an important change. Before the flood, when everything was very good, or even going back before the fall, there wouldn't have been any fear on the earth, either from man or the animals, because everything was very good, so there was nothing to fear. But this is a statement made by God that this is a significant change in the general ecology and in the relationship between people and animals. Right. And God then goes on to explain why. Into your hands these are delivered. And here is a really significant change in the way people and animals live. Every moving thing that lives shall be yours for food. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you anything. So God is now making a contrast between what things were like before the flood compared with what things are going to be like after the flood. And so there is a significant change. In the beginning, of course, God created man and the animals to eat plants. Now they're going to be enabled or given permission to eat basically anything that moves. So this is a great difference to the sort of evolutionary diet story that we have from the evolutionary history of human beings. And this is important. You cannot just impose biblical history onto the evolutionary worldview. They are completely different. So the standard story is that most people have in their minds, somehow we evolved from apes which were vegetarian. Most of the time, they do occasionally kill each other and other animals, but they're basically vegetarian. Now, somehow evolving hominids lived on a mixed diet, and they discovered fire, or how to control fire, which meant that they could cook food. And these evolved into archaic human beings, which lived as hunter-gatherers. So they went out hunting animals, and they went out gathering plant materials, tubers, berries, fruits, things like that. But it was mostly a meat diet that people imagine. And the typical picture is your caveman in his cave, cooking the large animal that he and his friends have just been out hunting together. And this is the basis of a lot of people thinking about the so-called paleo diet. There's a lot of interesting research going on now that suggests that cavemen actually ate their greens, because we now have the technology to analyze the remains of plant foods in the pottery and the artifacts that are left inside caves. After that, archaic human beings are somehow evolved into modern human beings who domesticated plants and animals and invented farming. Now, that is the very opposite of the story of human beings that we are told in the Bible, and particularly in the changeover that came from before the flood and after the flood. So let's go back to the Bible diet history, right, or how things have changed from creation through the fall and onto the flood. So in creation, or in the beginning rather, Adam and Eve lived in a beautiful, fruitful garden, and they were told to eat plants. And there were plenty of good, nutritious plants for them to eat, with a lot of variety. And all animals ate plants, so they didn't go out and kill one another. This was the very good world, the world of a beautiful, fruitful garden where people ate plants, all animals ate plants. After the fall of man and God cursed the ground, people still cultivated crops for food. And in fact, the judgment that God metes out on Adam specifically mentioned, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread. In other words, it's going to become hard work. Now, God did not change what they could eat. It's just that because he cursed the ground, it was going to be much harder work to get that food. We are also told in the next generation, with the story of Cain and Abel, that people were keeping animals. Now, why would they keep animals? Well, we know about sacrifices, and also people now had to wear clothes, and animals are a good source of fibers. So people were initially gardeners. The oldest profession in the world is gardening, right? Then they were farmers. So what happened to get the sort of variety of lifestyles that we have in food gathering that we have through known history? All right. So after the flood, God specifically gives permission to kill and eat animals and birds and fish. Now, there were no restrictions on the kinds of creatures that it says everything that basically moves. So if you could catch it and kill it, it was fair game. We have to remember that the Jewish food laws came in with the law of Moses. And but immediately after the flood, God told Noah and his family, you can now catch and eat anything that moves. Now that means that we have natural and human selection that will determine the survival of both cultivated plants and animals. And the reason for that is that, as we've heard from Glenn and from Craig, the environment drastically degenerated with the extremes of weather that we have after the flood. And that would have led to a lot of natural selection. Natural selection is a real process. Animals really had a hard time surviving in some of the extremes, right? And people did as well. And we have to remember that after the flood, people did stay together for a while, but they were eventually dispersed all over the world after the Tower of Babel. And by that time, a significant amount of degeneration would have happened, and people would have found themselves in very difficult environments where it was not possible to cultivate plants and animals to the intensity that you have with farming. And people would have lost their technology as well when they were scattered. So some people would have lost the ability to farm, and they became hunter-gatherers. So being a hunter-gatherer is not the beginning, it's actually the result of hundreds of years of history due to the degeneration of the environment following the flood. Now, what about animals? Well, animals avoided human beings for survival. God built that in so that we wouldn't wipe them out straight away. But we have managed to wipe out quite a few. There's rather a sad history of human-induced extinction. During this process of degeneration of the environment, animals would have moved out from the site of the flood, from the ark, and they would have to make their own way as best they can. As the environment degenerated, plant foods would have become less nutritious and in some places almost disappear. So animals would make the most of what they could and became scavengers or carnivores. In other words, they started to eat each other. Now, the interesting thing is that we are told that animals evolved to become carnivores. They were almost as it were designed by nature, is one of the common expressions you'll come across in a lot of popular science literature. Because they have things like sharp claws, they have teeth, they have speed and agility that you need for hunting. Now, all of those things we observe in the animal world, in the bird world. Those things do not make an animal a carnivore. We've said numerous times in various programs that we put on, there are plenty of examples of animals that do have sharp teeth and claws, but they eat plants, right? Those things do not make an animal a carnivore, but animals that already have sharp teeth or have claws or have speed and agility needed to hunt, those things don't make an animal a carnivore, but they do facilitate it. So animals that already had those features became carnivores. Animals that didn't had to find a way of surviving in places where there were enough plant foods or they died out. And so here is an example of an animal that has become a carnivore within our observed living memory. The Kea parrot, which is a parrot in New Zealand. It's the world's only alpine parrot. It lives high up in the mountains in New Zealand, and it does have particularly sharp beak, long pointed beak, curved pointed beak, a real weapon of war, as it were. And it does have sharp claws. Now, as we've said many times in creation research, sharp things are very good for cutting, but they don't necessarily have to be for cutting up meat or other animals. They're just as good for cutting up fruit and nuts and shoots. And they're also useful for digging for roots. So this bird is well designed to live on a vegetarian diet, but the same sharp beak and the same sharp claws can also be used to dig up grubs and other invertebrates and things in the soil. Now, in New Zealand, when the wild food became scarce, the parrots started to attack sheep. Now, one of the reasons that the wild food did become scarce was because of the spread of farming and a lot of trees were cut down. A lot of the wild food sources were removed, and so the parrots. Well, parrots are actually very smart, and they will go looking for food wherever they can find it. And they did start to attack sheep. Now, they didn't actually kill sheep directly. I mean, they're a fairly small bird compared with the size of a sheep. However, what they would do is pick at their skin and wound them, sometimes quite severely, so that the sheep would die from septicemia and infection. And they were rather a scourge. And for a while in New Zealand, there was actually a bounty on them because they were a damage to sheep. Now they've stopped that, I think, back in the early 70s. But nevertheless, this is an example of a creature that is well designed to eat plant foods, but has been observed in living memory to take up eating animal foods. Now, that happened many, many times over in the centuries after the flood. So what happens in general to animals and people after the flood in terms of surviving? Well, I think it was rather well summarized in this sign that I came across in one of my visits to Kew Gardens. This was a display about climate change. And as Glenn and Craig have described very well to us tonight, the flood was the most spectacular climate change that's ever happened on the earth. We are observing climate change. It's nothing compared to what's happened in biblical history. And as a result of climate change and the environmental degradation that happened after the flood, animals and people were faced with, how do we cope with this? Well, you can either move to a place where food is available, and so that would account for why certain animals live in particular places over the earth these days. They can adapt. Now, we have to remember that adaptation is not an evolutionary process. It's actually a design feature. Adapt means that you have the ability to cope with changes in the environment using the features you already have. So it does have its limits. So creatures like the Kea parrot, like many other creatures that have sharp teeth and sharp claws, or that have speed and ability, were able to adapt by changing from a plant diet to a meat-based diet, to a carnivorous diet, become birds of prey or animals of prey. And during this process, we have very severe natural and unnatural selection as well, and that means a lot of animals did die out. So move, adapt, or go extinct. That's what's happened after the flood, and it has particularly related to diet and what things were available for animals to eat. And if we can come back to us now, I'm sure there are other things that the others would like to add, and there may be some more questions as well.
I want to say that the earliest profession, Diane, wasn't gardening, it was taxonomy. Adam named the animals.
That's very true, actually. Yes.
Sorry to be flippant, but that was great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good. All right,
Yeah.
Sam,
I wanted
questions. Oh, go ahead.
No, go on, Craig. What are you going to say?
I was just going to say, with regards to the teeth and eating meat, Diane, I want to get a display in the museum where I've got a bunch of different skulls and ask people, well, which one of these is the carnivore, but have no carnivores up there. Have a panda, a fruit bat, which has got very sharp teeth. And another one that really intrigues me is go to the zoo and have a look at a gibbon. Their teeth are vicious, big, massive fangs. And they're primarily fruit eaters. So there's a whole bunch of skulls you could get. I think last week even John showed the Chinese water deer, which has got massive fangs, and of course it's a herbivore.
Yeah, 100%. Right, let's do a question here. This is an interesting one. Felix Fortuna Magnus on YouTube says, How did a sloth that moves so slow get to South America after landing in Turkey and not get extinct by carnivores along the way? Odd.
Yeah, odd. But there's various ways. It could be slowly walking, could be by these floating mats. There could be any number of ways, even, taken with people. There's such a friendly looking, animal. There could be a lot of ways that they got there, but fact is they got there.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, we've got Diane showed the picture of the Tasmanian devil. It's in Tasmania. I mean, we're at the far end of the world here as well. They're not a big animal. They're not particularly fast, and they don't necessarily wander massive distances. So how did they get here? And the only answer is that they got here by walking, or they got here with the help of humans. So, I mean, I don't think for the Tasmanian devil, at least, that floating mats is the solution. But certainly walking, and we know the land bridges across to the Americas, probably as the waters really dropped during the post-flood stages. The Bering Strait was connected to northern Russia there, and people walked across as well as many other creatures.
Yeah.
Great stuff. All right. Let's do another question. Here we go. This one, another one comes in from Sandy C. Question. Could some of the geological features we see today be caused by other extinction type events like the days of Peleg or meteors striking the Earth?
Well, I think we ought to be careful with calling meteors striking the Earth extinction events. There's definitely evidence of meteors striking Earth, and there's craters around the Earth where there's no question that something's hit the ground. But we don't get drawn into this idea that they're necessarily extinction events. For example, we constantly hear this idea that dinosaurs became extinct as a result of a meteor hitting the Earth, whereas what we find all dinosaurs in is buried in sediments laid down by water. So why can't a flood be the answer for that? That's where all the evidence really lies. So, we certainly don't deny that these things have occurred. It's the subsequent consequences of those things that we would question causing extinctions and so on. Maybe local extinctions, but not worldwide ones.
And science is making observations. We have observed meteors hitting the ground. They don't always cause a cavity. In fact, I think rarely do they do. But we have never seen a meteor hit the ground that caused any type of extinction event. But then it would have to be an extinction event that only killed dinosaurs, not all the other animals. It didn't make everything else go extinct, which you'd have to explain that. And then you'd have to explain how we have so much evidence of dinosaurs being here with humans at the same time. Clearly, the meteors are not an extinction event.
Yeah. Also, as well, it's interesting. I was watching David Attenborough's dinosaur documentary a couple of years ago now, and it's interesting how the meteor struck, and then it depicts a giant tsunami washing over and eliminating the dinosaurs and burying them in under sediment and things like that. And whenever you read about dinosaurs becoming extinct or other sort of local sort of events, that sort of thing, it's always water, because that's how you get fossils. And yet they won't concede to the fact that it's a worldwide flood. And that's what I find particularly confusing, but then also not confusing at the same time, because they don't want to admit that there's a creator and they don't want to be liable for their sin. They don't want to see themselves as bad people.
Yet the conclusion of our explorations of Mars is that it had a worldwide, a global flood event. And we're going to talk about that at some point. This evidences for all the water, a global flood event, yet they can't find water. Well, we are 70% water, but they will not accept a global flood event. But we talked about climate change. Well, why did the dinosaurs go extinct? Well, it was most likely predominantly climate change because of the end of the Ice Age. And because of the Ice Age, because these are reptiles, they don't handle cold very well. So going into an Ice Age after the flood would put them under very, not just stress, but it would limit their habitat. It would limit where they would be, to which would make them easy to be hunters and hunted out. So I think it's very much a climate change scenario as to why they died out. Now, that was recently, because like I said, we have so many accounts, and not only, the research that Joe is doing on soft tissue, that we still have soft tissue in the dinosaur bones, which means they're thousands of years, not millions of years.
The other part of the question, sorry, Diane, if you wanted to say something, or
No, you go ahead.
The other part of the question is the days of Peleg, and the Earth was divided in the days of Peleg. There's two ways of looking at that, and I think Shogiwa has raised one of them, is that it most likely does refer to the Babel dispersion rather than the land surface being divided as such. John has often mentioned about some of the Aboriginal legends that talk about the fact that they came from the centre of the world amidst much war and fighting. And so post-Babel, there may well have been a lot of wars, and therefore the Earth was divided. People split and left that area. I think that that's probably the best explanation rather than the land splitting.
And keep in mind, the Tower of Babel was 100 years after the flood. So it was right there at the beginning of the Ice Age. So as they're dispersing, they're going into extreme changes in the climate, like nothing they had seen in the first 100 years. So it's interesting. And, did God use meteors to break open the fountains of the deep? That's something that's been discussed many, many times. Maybe it was meteors that set it off. All we know is he says he broke open the earth. And so that's all we can go by.
Yep. Broke open the earth, and then all the bad stuff happened to the dinosaurs. Anyway, right. Let's move on to another question. Let's do. There's been a few that's come in recently. There's a good one from Doki Doki. Sahara Desert came soon after a global flood.
I think soon after the Ice Age.
Yeah. Yes, you go, Diane.
There is good evidence that the region, which is now the Sahara Desert, used to be a lot wetter. In fact, one quote that I found was 10 times wetter, and people used to live there, and they used to cook quite luscious looking or luscious sounding plant foods, actually. And they found the residues of these in some of the buried artifacts that are still there. It is a good example of how the environment degenerated after the flood. Immediately after the flood, the earth was still moist. I mean, it took a long time for it to dry out. So areas that are now deserts would have been much more lush, where people could live, where animals could live. The same applies to Australia. There are the remains of giant animals, giant vegetation, which is no longer there. So the Sahara Desert was once upon a time the Green Sahara, and that is a term you will come across in the general science news. People lived there. It was much more lush, but it dried out as part of the sort of massive global changes that happened after the flood.
Mm-hmm.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they have found evidence in parts of the Sahara where there were remnant crocodile populations well inland in sort of some oasis type conditions that survived into fairly recent times before it dried completely out and they died out.
We have a few references to the Green Sahara in our fact file. If you go to our fact file, there are a few references to what the Sahara Desert used to be like. And the same goes for other arid areas all over the world, including Australia.
Great stuff. Right, another question. Felix asked another question. Would a global flood event mean the water is sea water, ocean, or fresh? And if salt water, and if it is salt water, wouldn't that stop plants from growing? Because we know that's what salt water does to plants.
I assume he's restricting that to the oceans. Talking about it's not talking about rainwater being salt water. I don't guess.
No, I think he's on about so the fountains of the deep and things like that. Was that salt water and how would that sort of affect like plants and seas and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Because salt water affects plants in a bad way.
Yes. So yes, I do think when he broke open the fountains of the deep, it was pumping mineral-rich hot water thermal vents into the waters. Now, were the seas before salt water? I think they were much lower. They were not like they are today. The oceans are increasing in salt with time. And if the Earth was billions of years old as they proposed, there would be no life. It would all be like the Dead Sea. Again, the salt content of the oceans and the rate at which salt is entering the oceans is good evidence that the Earth is young.
There are some plants that can grow in salt waters. There are huge seagrass meadows. Now, these are plants like land plants. The evolutionary story is that the plants moved onto land and these ones didn't like it, so they moved back into the sea. But these are particularly lush and important ecosystems, actually, seagrass meadows. And we also need to remember that the point that Craig made about salt water and fresh water not immediately mixing, because one of the questions we have in our Ask site, on our question and answer site, was what happened to the fish that live in the sea if the rain that came in the flood was fresh water. How did the fresh water and the saltwater fish survive? And we have an answer to that if you'd like to look it up. But basically, some fish these days, even now, can be quite adaptable to changes in the salt content. There is a limit to that, of course. That's another example of adaptation being a built-in process. These days, there are some fish that can only live in one or the other environment. That's actually a degeneration. That's a loss of a function, which is another thing that happened after the flood. Because as part of the degeneration of the world in general, the mutation rate and the stress and disease rate would have gone up, which is another whole area we could go into, and maybe we will.
Well, why don't we? There was a question similar to that. What was the question about hyperevolution?
I'm on mute here. Yeah, this one here for Doki Doki. Are Christians forced to employ hyper-evolution or rapid evolution to explain today's amount of species after the animals left the ark?
Diane?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of change, and quite rapid change. People think that creationists don't believe in change. Yes, we do. We believe in a lot of change, but it's not evolution. And I think this would be a good question to follow up on another sort of after the flood program. We're starting to run out of time. But yes, as animals dispersed in smaller groups, you would have small groups that would only interbreed with one another, and they would lose the ability to breed with other animals where they've been physically separated from one another. Technically, that is speciation, but it's not evolution. It's just a splitting up of the kinds. And it can happen quite rapidly. But so yes, it's a rapid change, but it's not evolution.
And we're looking at, you go, Glenn.
No, go ahead. And I'm going to add something.
Well, I was just going to say that we're looking at it in an upside down way to the evolutionists. We're not gradually evolving a whole bunch of new genes. We're starting with the perfect gene pool, and in a good environment pre-flood, and then post-flood, you've got all of these variable environments and conditions that the creatures then, with their sort of perfect or maybe slightly less than perfect following the fall gene pool, then sort of adapts to, and it could have been quite quick in some circumstances. One of the things that jumps to my mind immediately is orchids, and the great variety of orchids that we see, and some of them are very specific in the environment that they like.
And I was going to add, after the flood, we go into this ice age. Well, it's going to put them into that extreme environment so that you're going to see this expressions of the genes that already exist coming out. Mm-hmm. It's not hyper, particularly if you look at, we talked about the mammoths. Mammoths are very slow. They're an elephant, very slow reproduction. They have one every 5 years. So if you look at after the flood, well, by year 10, you would have only had those two mating twice. Now you've only got 4. You've had the 2 original plus their 2 new ones. By year 100, you've only got around 1,000. Well, I've got it as 1,258 that have reproduced. But by the time you get 200 years, you've got 232,000 of them. Then by the time you get to the peak of the ice age, which is around, year 350, you got 25 million. Well, if you take that same compounding interest and you start exposing those to these various extreme environments of an ice age, and wetter areas and then drying out areas, you could very easily, very rapidly see this diversification of the kinds within the kinds. Yes,
Great
I
stuff.
cheated and looked at my spreadsheet where I did the simple calculations.
You're all good, Glenn. Don't worry. Right, we'll leave it there. Some really good questions. We didn't have time to get to, but as usual, we do have Q&A sessions every now and again. Next week, we're tackling the Trinity, I believe. We're going to be addressing sort of some of the objections to the Trinity, why Trinity is biblical, where we find it in Scripture, things like that. I'm certainly looking forward to that one. God's triune nature. I might be able to actually do a presentation on that, actually, potentially, but who knows? We'll see where the Lord takes us. But just a few plugs from me before we go.
And one thing from me before we go, if you don't mind,
sure.
I'm not going to be here next week, so I'll miss y'all. I'll be recovering from surgery. But just remember, there is going to be another extinction event, and there is going to be another major climate change coming. And that is, Christ is going to come again, and we're going to have a new heaven and a new earth, and it's going to be glorious. But you got to trust Christ as Savior to take part in that, to be there for that new heaven, new earth. So I encourage all of you. God's word is true, as we've showed today. So trust Him as your Savior.
Amen. Amen, Glenn. Right. Quick plug from me. Sign up to our newsletters. Go to linkin.bio/creation research. Or if you have a fancy smartphone, you can scan it with your smartphone camera. You just tap on that QR code there, and that'll take you to your to all of our links. Also, as well, we've launched Creation Research Live. This is the best way to support the ministry, as well as also get a whole bunch of things you can educate yourself with, and showing like a small group or something like that. So please do check that out. Prices start at $9.99 and then a yearly subscription is $90. Obviously, prices will change according to where you are in the world. So that's just 1 or 2 plugs from me. And also don't forget as well, we are part of as a podcast. Also as well, the keen-eyed among you may notice that Google Podcasts is ceasing to exist. But don't worry, you can import your podcast, if you do use Google Podcasts, onto other applications like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Cast, things like that. We're on all those platforms anyway, so just search for Creation Conversations and we'll come up. So that's it from me in terms of little plugs and things like that. So thank you very much all for watching. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next week. Any final words, guys?
I just wanted to say thank you to all the chatsters. We survived without Joe, who was going to do a major part of the presentations today. So we'll beat him up later. But thanks to everyone for their great questions and participation. And I think we got through it okay.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we survived. We survived our own flood event of the lack of Joe. Anyway, that was a terrible joke. Let's just move on. Right. Okay. Right. God bless everyone, and we'll see you next week. See ya.
Goodbye.
Bye.